We can't miss an opportunity to see our newest acquisition or loan from Josh Bartlett.
Well, it's not. It's actually from my wife and her brother. The kind of a newest little collection, and we figured that this is where it belonged. Fred Davis lived in this town all his life. Actually lived in the building that is now Zellick's, and then lived down on Route 25. But in the 1920s, Fred was born in 1915. In the late 1920s, actually more in the early 1930s and through the 30s, Fred, like a lot of people in this town, did what they needed to do to make a living. And Fred trapped and hunted and was kind of a handyman. But one of the things, John mentioned that it was very seasonal, maple sugaring, but even before that, in the late winter or real early spring, a real good crop that was available for somebody that was willing to work hard was ice. Now, before refrigeration, before mechanical refrigeration, ice was a very good crop, and the men in town would put together crews, and they usually used either Garland Pond or Canasatka because they were both closer to the road. And it would be a crew that went out and cut ice off the pond. Generally, they wanted the ice about 8 inches thick. And they'd use a horse-drawn plow, which we were pretty sure there was one here, but we weren't able to find it. But there was a horse-drawn plow that they used to cut grooves in the ice. They cut them about as deep as they could, about 4 inches, and cut lines. And then there would be a sawyer who would take a saw like this and cut the ice the rest of the way. And the idea was to cut it in blocks about 16 or 18 inches wide, 8 inches thick, and about 30 or 32 inches long. They weighed about 125 pounds, which was about as much as they expected to be able to handle. After they cut them, they chip them out with a chisel. This was probably made here in Moultonborough. It's handmade, and Wakefield, whose blacksmith shop still exists. It's down the little building on the right-hand side just before you get to the dump. It's
across from Ottenberg.
Yeah, Ottenberg, I think, owns it now, but that was his blacksmith shop, and this thing is hand-forged, the handle is. And this is kind of cool in that it has a couple of company names on it, but I don't know whether they were the company that made it, or he repaired it, or what the story is. But it has pointed shoulders on it, so along with cutting the ice, you could also corral a block and pull it in with it. When you got it close enough, they'd have a gin pole set up, basically a two pair of bipod legs with a derrick arrangement on top of it. They'd have a very big pair of ice tongs. Grab the block, this would be tied to the bottom end of that gin pole. That gin pole might be 20 feet long, and the people end of it would be 12 or 15 feet. So there'd be a rope tied to the end of it, so they could lift the block out of the water and then rotate this whole pole derrick boom over and let the block of ice down on the sled. If they needed to handle the ice, those big blocks, this is a short ice peavy which you can use to catch the block of ice and set it up on end or roll it over, and generally just push it around with it. The blocks were then taken to ice houses, and there were a bunch of them here in town. I'm sure John knows where there's a bunch of them. And yeah, well, Laconia Ice Company was huge. But where Bob Wallace lives, there was a little ice house there between the barn and the house. Basically, they were double walled. They filled the space between the walls with sawdust, which of course the ants liked real well, so they didn't last very long. But then the blocks of ice would be put into these ice houses and packed in sawdust. If they were shipping them to Boston, which they did, put them on a wagon, take it over to Meredith, put it in a rail car, and take it to Boston for the restaurants down there, but also up here, they'd also cut the blocks into sizable blocks, 25-pound blocks, and the small blocks, which were about 8 inches cubed, you could handle with a pair of tongs like that. These are also good for picking up small children.
Or cats.
And cats, getting their attention. But John's told some stories. I got one quick story about Fred Davis. At least the story I heard was that this was a real good way to make a good amount of cash if you were willing to work hard. They were paid on piecework, and Fred told me that his rate as a sawyer was 3 cents a block. And the story is that on at least one occasion, he made $9 in one day. That's 300 blocks of ice in an 11-hour day, which is about all the daylight they had. And he probably was the highest paid man in Moultonborough at the time. Because $9 a day in 1935 was probably a whole bunch of money. Not that you could keep that rate up very long.
I think I can remember Herb Martin saying that he used to get 25 cents or 50 cents a cord of wood a day.
Yeah, make a half a buck.
Yeah.
Work your tail off and make a half a dollar. But the whole ice harvesting thing only lasted for about 6 weeks if they were lucky, maybe 4. And they kind of made hay when the sun shined. But these tools are on loan from Fred's daughter, my wife, and her brother, and we hope that they help with the museum. Norm did a great job. They're on the story is on the website, and as are the pictures.